This is Michael Clemens with Excel Japan's podcast for 2025. We're happy to welcome Tim Hewitt, representing BMS in Japan, to talk a little bit more about the M&A market vis-a-vis insurance. And so, Tim, thank you for joining.
Thanks, Michael. Pleasure to be here.
Could you just maybe start off with introducing a little bit about yourself and your background
Sure.
in Japan, which I think goes back quite a bit?
Right. It goes back about, I think, altogether about 17 years. I've lived in Japan, not consecutively. I started when I was 16 as an exchange student.
Oh, wow.
And then that experience, changed the rest of my life, and everything sort of snowballed from there into what's become now. And I did so well in Japanese that I ended up getting into law school, which wasn't something I had expected. So I became a lawyer, worked in private practice, worked on corporate transactions. I then went out into an in-house role, went into a commercial role, and I've kind of combined all of these roles now together into what I do for BMS here in Japan.
And it's interesting because I think it probably needs a lot of that experience that you have to be able to look at the market where it's at today. I think in my time in Japan, M&A certainly has been alive, but anything having to do with like hostile takeovers, etc., has always been very taboo. But as we move more into a more friendlier M&A market, it seems to be also the necessity of more mergers and acquisitions, simply because of previous guests that we've had that said, look, the demand is there for Japanese companies, but the pressure is very much on the shoulders of the people that work there. And so more and more you're going to see companies that are being acquired by larger companies so that the demand can continue to be met, but then combining them, will hopefully help out the people.
That's right.
Why Japan? What BMS is based in the UK, if I'm correct, and so why is Japan a market that the firm is interested in being in?
Sure. I think in answering that question, I think we can also be a bit of a segue into talking about all the macro factors that are making Japan a bit of a hotbed for M&A activity at the moment. So why? Well, first of all, who is BMS? BMS is, as you said, it's a UK headquartered company. It is a global specialty insurance broker. We are, when I say specialty, we focus on insurances that you really need experts to broker. Our Asia platform, we primarily focus on insurance solutions for M&A transactions, and that encompasses a whole different type of insurances. And we've now expanded the practice on the back of that into other areas, other financial lines, and also a reinsurance practice. But until 2 years ago, Japan hadn't come into the fold. And why Japan? It's one of Asia's, obviously. Japan is the third largest economy in the world. To be truly Asian, have an Asian presence, not having Japan is really leaving something out.
Exactly.
And so many synergies need to happen to be able to facilitate a pure Asian practice, by having Japan. So not having Japan was always going to be a problem for BMS to establish itself as a truly Asian a company with an Asian presence. And it was just a matter of finding, I guess, myself who was willing to take on the opportunity of a no-name brand and come into this market. But someone, as you said, with kind of this mixture of skill sets. You need, particularly with the type of insurance we place, it's not someone you can really find in typical insurance with insurance experience. It's really someone who's had experience as a lawyer, worked in M&A, worked in transactions, worked in a range of different industries, and then is willing to sort of pivot their career, become qualified as an insurance broker, which is itself a very big hurdle here in Japan.
Can imagine.
Because the test is in Japanese. And that was a great challenge for myself, which fortunately I was able to get through. And so all of those things sort of came together magically for me to be able to take on this opportunity.
Do you find like Japan has different policies that they're interested in, or rather the Japan market is interested in unique policies compared to other places, or just in general, by using the insurance, it's really try to mitigate risk maybe that they didn't think of, I presume, during due diligence, etc. I mean, what's unique about Japan?
Perhaps it's almost a bit like, apparently Henry Ford is famous for saying that if I asked my customer what they'd want, it would be a faster horse. And it's a bit the same. Using insurance as part of deal making in Japan hasn't been traditionally, par for the course, whereas it may have been more prevalent in, let's say, more Western jurisdictions. And even within Asia, the jurisdictions like Hong Kong, Singapore, that kind of follow more of a, let's say, a Western style type of deal making. And so it's more just perhaps the reason why it hasn't been so prevalent in Japan is because people didn't really know it was there. There wasn't really a need for it. A lot of deal making perhaps was done domestically with just between parties and based on trust. And historically, that's how M&A was done.
Right.
And just really, the market's just taking a bit longer here to catch up compared to other markets that have become more sophisticated. Insurance for M&A transactions itself was really only something that began 20 years ago. And now it's become, very prevalent in, the US, Europe, Australia, and other parts of Asia.
So I think we can assume that a lot of M&A is done domestically, and maybe with the market growing, I think Japan is probably using a lot of its cash, which it tends to hang on to in a lot of these companies, to actually acquire innovation or look globally to be doing more transactions. And so would you also find that that's the reason that people are probably entertaining having M&A insurance more?
Absolutely. I mean, there's two drivers for insurance for this product. One was actually private equity, and there's a huge influx now of private equity coming into Japan. Foreign investors are looking, for assets in Japan and to place capital here. So that's one driver. We could talk later about why it really suits private equity as financial investors. Insurance gives them a clean exit by not having to be on the hook for any indemnification when they're selling an asset. Also, when they're buying an asset, it's strategic because they don't have to, it more facilitates the negotiation because they don't have to, they still have to get reps and warranties from the seller, but the seller might be more in a position to give them if they know that they're not going to be the ones on hook for it ultimately, because the insurer can back it.
Makes your job more difficult.
It does.
Or challenging.
But that's the whole purpose of why, we're a broker, and having, people who are deal makers who've come into broking to be able to facilitate this. What we do is not kind of cookie cutter insurance. It's tailor-made for each transaction. The other driver, of course, is, Japan, as you said, notwithstanding the weak yen, is Japanese companies are now being forced, through lots of regulatory changes to improve their cash performance and price to book ratios and to get better return for their investors. And that really, with all the macro economic factors challenging Japan, aging population, etc., having to seek opportunities overseas for Japanese companies through M&A is becoming more and more prevalent.
And what would you say are some of the common misconceptions about M&A insurance amongst companies considering deals in Japan, whether that be from overseas or domestically?
Some common misconceptions is that it's expensive.
Right.
That it is just purely a cost. It's not really understanding that it's not that it is something that's fixed, that it can't be negotiated.
Right.
Perhaps also that it's complex and challenging. It does add another work stream into the deal. And if you don't have, I guess, good representation and a good broker, it could become another challenge and difficult. But it shouldn't be the case.
And what are some unique challenges that companies in Japan face when having these M&A transactions? I mean, I think very quickly one can think language, but that isn't necessarily the biggest one. But I mean, what are some of the biggest challenges or unique challenges?
Language was actually one of the biggest challenges for getting insurance in Japan, partly because the insurers that offer this insurance, there are just very few here in Japan, first of all. And the underwriting capabilities that they have to place this insurance were usually their foreign teams.
Right.
So even the likes of a Sompo or a Tokyo Marine, these huge Japanese companies, it was actually their foreign team. So even for a domestic transaction, until recently, for the insurance to be placed, it would have to be done in English, which, as you can imagine, that was a huge barrier for it, particularly if it was a domestic transaction.
Sure. Are you able to give examples without naming names of situations that have been mitigated by insurance during an M&A transaction? I mean, what's an example?
I mean, we've done a number of firsts here in the market. I think that's partly because, we're a challenger in the market and we're looking to do different things. And also we have globally one of the most expert teams in this space. And so, we're able to bring that here to this market. One was doing insurance for a take-private transaction. So this is, what was a public company being acquired by a PE investor and then been taken private. Problem with take-privates is normally you don't have a shareholder because it's a public company, that can give the reps on behalf of themselves or on behalf of the target. And the target as well wouldn't be sort of in a position to give reps and warranties to a buyer. In this case, it wasn't a hostile takeover, it was a friendly takeover. There was an existing founder that was able to give reps and warranties, but they weren't necessarily willing to do so because, partly, notwithstanding, they were, within the business for a very long time, it was taking on a lot of liability for them.
Sure.
And so insurance there sort of bridged that hesitance, if you like. So that's one example. We've also gone on to now find where there isn't, say, a situation where it can be a friendly takeover, and there is no one to give, in that situation, reps and warranties. We have now insurers that are willing to sort of stand in place of the seller and give synthetically reps and warranties for the purpose of the policy. So that's another development in the market that we're starting to see.
So I think, as long as I've been here, and certainly long before I came along, Japan really is heavily insured overall. I mean, whether it be on a personal insurance, almost every kind of insurance imaginable. Japanese are very risk adverse, and if I can make that statement. What kind of corporate culture in Japan or Japanese corporate culture kind of influences the approach of the insurance? Because I think on the one hand, where they're risk adverse, at the other flip of the coin, they're also extremely conscious of cost.
Indeed.
And almost sometimes when they need to cut costs, it gets down to the bone. And so I can't help but believe this cost is seen somewhere between the bone and the muscle.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
That is a huge challenge, and a lot of people do say to me, it must be easy because Japanese are so risk adverse. But Japanese corporates, to your point, are extremely cost sensitive, and this is often seen as an additional cost. And there is actually almost a negative perception within corporates about insurance because, maybe they've had the experience where they've gone to make a claim, bid under some sort of general operational insurance, and there's lots of disclaimers, lots of exclusions that they weren't aware of, and they've come out feeling that it wasn't really worth the cost. Our job, certainly as a broker, is to work for the insured to really reduce any kind of exclusion. And I can get into it later, but we only really accept for exclusions as standard, and everything else is up for negotiation depending on the deal.
And I think, needless to say, trust is a huge factor, not only between the parties involved, but maybe even yourself on both sides of the transaction. I mean, how long, if that can even be answered, do you feel is like the onboarding of a client in that regard? I mean, trust obviously is very important in what you're doing.
100%. I mean, to answer that in two angles. First of all, is just, you know, if you trust each other, then why do you need insurance?
Exactly.
And perhaps there has been somewhat of a perception that, you know, if you're requesting insurance from a counterparty, or that you're telling them you're going to take insurance, that, you know, to back up their reps and warranties, then perhaps, you know, it implies that you're not fully trustworthy. It's often the opposite, really. This actually facilitates trust, particularly if you've got a situation where you have like a shareholder rolling over into the acquisition vehicle or existing management and such, that you don't need to actually then go and sue them if there is a breach of the reps and warranties. It takes away that, you know, direct litigious type sort of position, because you have insurance there to back you up. The other side, you know, is how do we establish a brand without any, you know, sort of name recognition?
Sure.
Notwithstanding, BMS, you know, is present in 35 countries around the world. There's a staff. It keeps growing at the moment. We're in a very ambitious acquisition cycle ourselves.
Yeah.
And, you know, every month it seems the amount of employees has gone up. I think it's somewhere around 1,500 at the moment.
Wow.
So it's not a small enterprise.
Sure.
But in Japan we're still not known. So it does. It takes a long time to build that engagement, to get the opportunity to get known. But, you know, I'm quite emboldened, if you like, or so far so good. We've been lucky enough to have several opportunities.
Right.
We've been lucky enough to make some firsts in the market, and it's just a matter of, you know, and, you know, we've now gone from just being myself to now a full team, including having, you know, my partner hire Lior from Deloitte. We have another broker who's Kauri, who's come up through. Actually, she was a Canadian broker, and an insurance industry expert. So we've got
diverse views.
Incredible bench strength, if you like, now,
Sure.
And obviously backed by, you know, our team throughout the region, also globally, including, you know, our boss Sandra, who ran Aon and the transaction liability practice for Aon for many years. So, and she, you know, cherry picked her best to come and, you know, set up BMS. So to be able to bring that to the market is very exciting, and we are making differences.
Yeah.
What's really endearing is when the insurers that we work with often say, you know, other brokers have never asked us this, or we don't normally see this or get asked to do this.
Interesting.
And like I mentioned before, we've introduced them first. We've even recently done, you know, insurance for real estate transactions, which historically were never insured here in Japan.
It's always good to keep people on their toes.
That's right.
Now, in my time here, I've seen the market go from 35,000 down to 7, now up to, you know, hovering around 40. I think everyone's natural question is, where's the growth, and how are we going to move forward? So on that note, especially diving into the regulatory environment that you're in, is there any new considerations that impact your insurance area, or are there any changes, et cetera, that are coming up that buyers and sellers should be aware of?
Well, first of all, there's a lot of disruption, is the word, in insurance. Now, I keep talking about, I say we're a broker. Now, actually, the majority of insurance in Japan is placed by agents who
Right.
work on behalf of the
Right.
Insurer, whereas a broker is actually licensed to place insurance, but actually works for the insured. A bit like a lawyer, you know, we have a duty of loyalty akin to a fiduciary duty to the insured. We have a different licensing regime, much more stringent than an agent. But there's been historically a lot of challenges, and just to give you a statistic that puts this in perspective, we were number 83rd insurance broker that was registered in Japan since the insurance brokering regime came about in the mid-90s after the market liberalised, financial markets in Japan liberalised. And in that time, how many years, almost 30 years, only 83, at that time, 2 years ago, only 83 brokers have been registered. Actually, and even amongst that 83, I think it's only a number in the mid-60s that are actually operational.
Right.
And that's partly because they've been, notwithstanding that the market's opened up and that a more independent insurance brokering kind of model came to Japan, there was a lot of challenges for that model. Partly, I think you could blame the agents. For example, brokers still aren't allowed to charge a fee to their client. Whereas an agent, so the model is that an agent receives a commission from the insurer after the insurance is placed. And we are treated the same. Now, that's not great for a broker, partly because I don't want to have my remuneration linked to how much insurance my client takes, because I want to make sure that I'm completely independent of that.
True.
But that's all changing. And there were recently a number of scandals. People familiar in Japan, people will heard about the big motor scandal, where collusions between basically agents and insurers to bump up insurance premiums were taking place, and the FSA is now really cracking down on that. And in the light of that, there's become kind of a highlight on perhaps the need for more consumer protections, and in order to achieve that, having more of a level playing field for insurance brokers.
I think same with Extel. We don't want our data and people that buy information from us to think of it as a nice to have, but a must have. And so as you continue to build up your business and kind of educate, for lack of a better word, on the necessity of having this, naturally you would like it just to be baked into a transaction as a must have. And in doing that, what is the advice that you give to participants in M&A transactions in their preparation for due diligence? I mean, are there now more dedicated teams to do this, or are people having to relearn the due diligence process? Are you really creating a situation which is becoming more institutionalized, for lack of a better word?
Certainly, it would be a great outcome, and we hope to get it to that point where insurance becomes more part of the deal toolkit, and more used strategically as part of the deal making. And for that, I think it's it's definitely an experience. It's something you have to experience well. And have had a positive experience with insurance being placed on your transaction, whether you are an advisor on that transaction, and you can see how the insurance has facilitated your negotiation. It certainly, I don't have a statistic because it's not something we can actually, given the confidentiality, confidential nature of what we do. But if there was some way to measure, the time it takes to close a deal or sign a deal that has insurance and that doesn't, then by far, it's much easier to close a transaction that has insurance. It takes out a lot of, the prolonged negotiation you need to have to negotiate around indemnities or stickly issues. Where it goes to due diligence, it's not that, if you don't need to do diligence if you can get insurance. That goes back to one of these big misconceptions people have. Insurers are willing to back a transaction on the premise that there has been a robust due diligence conducted.
Yeah.
But due diligence is always a balance of cost and benefit analysis. How much, how wide, how deep do you go on a DD? Is always a matter of a risk assessment, and by the same token, that's how insurers will also look at it. So what we do as brokers, we can really help kind of inform, for the reps and warranties that you're negotiating. If you get us in early, we can help you kind of guide you in which areas you should conduct and to what level of DD and you'd want to undertake to make sure you can get coverage for the rep that you're trying to negotiate.
So as we look forward, and I think it's exciting. I mean, I've been a bull in Japan for decades, but as we look forward, what do you see as the future of M&A insurance? I mean, to me, it's the third question: who's the buyer, who's the seller, and who's going to insure this? To me, it's like the natural third question. But what do you see as kind of like emerging trends that are coming that companies should be aware of?
In terms of, as it comes to insurance, I think more and more the insurance as a product for M&A transactions is evolving. Again, we're going back to misconceptions before, it's not a static thing. We are having more success in getting, so insurance will, historically for M&A transactions, where we talk about, we didn't go into which types of insurance there are, but basically we can broadly categorize them in two types. One that cover unknown risks and one that cover known risks. So you do your due diligence, and obviously through that due diligence, a number of things come up. But as we mentioned before, it's always a trade-off of how wide and how deep do you go. So in theory, there is always things that you might not have found. And that's what we call warranties and indemnities insurance, or reps and warranties insurance, as it's called in the US, covers. It covers the unknown risks for things that weren't discovered in the due diligence, effectively. But the things that could be known tax risks. So in the areas that we often see as tax, and other sort of contingent liabilities, where you might have, for example, a notice from a regulatory authority, might be some sort of environmental notice, but you might have remedial, you might not. That it's all contingent on an outcome of another event. So these are different other types of insurances that we can arrange and cover for sort of known risks as well. So I think what's good for people to have some sort of idea of, and for your listeners, the one thing they could take home is that, for all the different risks that come up in a transaction, there potentially could be an insurance solution for them. There's also in the market now a broker like BMS, whose job is to actually creatively try and find insurance solutions for those risks. And please come and challenge us to do that.
Yeah. I mean that's innovation, right? AI. Two little letters. Some people get passionate about this. Some people are fearful of it. How do you see technological advances like AI or data analytics impacting both the M&A insurance landscape and what you do?
I see them being a great accelerator for it, where there's a huge amount of potential for innovation is the underwriting. It's getting, obviously in that whole conduct of due diligence. I've been talking with another company, Kenja, and they do like they provide databases, and kind of like I call it SharePoint on steroids, and they use a lot of AI solutions, overlays for the database. And one solution that could potentially be done, if we had all the due diligences that were conducted on every M&A transaction, then we would have this AI machine that could do due diligence better than any advisor. No, I'm not the first to say that, this is an area of disruption. Obviously, lawyers and other advisors are facing, and I don't think it makes lawyers redundant at all, but it just, a lot of the processes around due diligence and how deep you can go, and the things you can find that you couldn't do relying on human review, or even more rudimentary kind of DD tools that we've had and that weren't backed by AI or facilitated by AI. And in theory, if that was the case, then you could, instead of going to an underwriter's council, insurers could use an AI tool to sort of review, basically put all the due diligence that was done, and get all the details of the transaction, the structure, the jurisdiction, its dynamics, its profile, all the rest of it, and then use an AI tool for the due diligence, and then give an assessment of the risk. And then they would underwrite according to that. So in that sense, I think it could be extreme enabler for M&A insurance.
I mean, when I hear AI, the second word that comes to mind is liability.
Right.
And it goes back to the days when we were creating algorithms, for example. And I'm like, great, in theory, algorithms are great as long as the quality assurance has been done on them, that they work properly, etc. And so interestingly, I think anybody who has AI as part of their business practice, or anything that kind of creates something of value that someone's going to be acquiring, it almost begs the question whether there should be AI insurance as well.
Right.
You know,
I guess that's
vis-a-vis that liability.
Yeah, I mean that would be for the insurers needing an AI for the tool that they've used to do their own underwriting and to sort of insure themselves.
So, in conclusion, even though it's early in the year, what kind of resources or tools do you guys recommend for companies that are looking to learn more about M&A insurance, besides, of course, your homepage and brochures, presumably, you can send out to them? But I mean, where can people find, unbiased information? There's such a thing.
Well, I think what I would like people to know is that there is now a market and other players here in the market. It's been very much really 1-2 players up until now that have sort of dominated the market, and that shop around is what I would say. For insurance and treat insurance like procuring any other service.
Sure.
Again, like I said, it's not something that's fixed, it's something that can have incredible different impact, not only just in the cost, but in terms of the coverage that you can get, in terms of who's actually broking your insurance. So I would encourage people to shop around and just be cognizant of there's more than just one option.
Right. Well, when we post this podcast, we're going to share with everyone, obviously, your contact information and how to get in contact with you. But is there anything kind of in summary or conclusion you'd like to mention or share with everyone?
Well, it's a great time to be in Japan.
Right.
As you said, we've been here a long time, but it's never felt this excited.
Yeah, I agree.
Or vibrant in terms of from a commercial perspective.
Yeah.
It really does feel like we're in the place to be at the moment. And obviously, there's an incredible tourist boom at the moment. There's just an incredible interest in Japan in general that there wasn't. Japan was always seen, uneasy, can't change. It can, and it is, and it will. It's also a very vibrant time to be doing business in Japan. I think we've really gone, past a tipping or inflection point or a tipping point where it isn't too hard anymore. It has its challenges, like any other jurisdiction. There's always the cultural element, and that's always going to be there. But there's far more, on both sides, there's far more Japanese that are more sort of, culturally fluent or cross-culturally fluent and engaged. So I would say if you're an investor, it's a great time to be in Japan. If you're a foreign investor, deal making is becoming more facilitative, including with having insurance. If you're a Japanese company looking overseas, it's a wonderful time, to be out there in the market and to be doing things.
Right. With you as their partner.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and you too.
Okay. Thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you.
So I'm Michael Clemens. I'm running Extel in Japan. We're going to be having the Japan research results coming out very soon, followed by the Japan executive results, and then very soon after that, the Asian and Australia results. So please stay tuned for our next episode. Thank you very much for joining.
Thank you.
Tim.